I never asked my mother why the suitcases appeared every evening. They materialized like clockwork. 2 battered roller bags and a canvas duffel lined up beside the front door of our apartment on Delancey Street the moment the sun dropped behind the Manhattan skyline. She'd pack them quietly while I did homework at the kitchen table, folding clothes with a precision that unnerved me, tucking canned goods into zippered pockets, slipping my passport and hers into the outer flap where she could reach them fast. Every morning, I'd wake to find them unpacked, the contents returned to drawers and cupboards as though the ritual had never happened. My mother would be at the stove making eggs, humming some half-remembered song from her childhood in the Philippines, and the suitcases would be back in the hall closet with the winter coats. She never explained. I never pushed. That was the architecture of our relationship, a cathedral built on things left unsaid. My name is Daniel Ramos. I was 17 the summer the world changed. My mother, Corazon, worked the night shift at Mount Sinai as a phlebotomist. She drew blood for a living. She understood what moved through veins better than anyone I knew. And I think that knowledge is what made her afraid before the rest of us had reason to be. She came home on a Tuesday in late June with her scrubs stuffed into a biohazard bag instead of her usual tote. She showered for 40 minutes. That night, the suitcases appeared for the first time. My best friend, Marco Villanueva, lived 2 floors above us. He noticed before I did. He came down to borrow rice. His abuela's pantry was perpetually missing one ingredient, and spotted the luggage lined up like soldiers awaiting deployment. "You guys going somewhere?" he asked, balancing a measuring cup on his palm. I shrugged. He looked at my mother, who was sealing a gallon bag of batteries at the counter. She smiled at him the way she smiled at patients before inserting a needle, warm, steady, and concealing something sharp. "Just being prepared," she said. Marco accepted this the way most teenagers accept the eccentricities of immigrant parents. He took his rice and left. I watched my mother lock the deadbolt behind him, then the chain, then the secondary chain she'd installed herself the week prior. By the 3rd night of packing, I confronted her. She was rolling my jeans into tight cylinders, a technique she said saved space in evacuation shelters, a detail that should have alarmed me more than it did. "Mom, what's happening?" She paused, her hand still pressing the denim flat. The television was on behind us, muted, cycling through news segments about a respiratory illness cluster in Sao Paulo. Hospitals overwhelmed. Footage of military cordons. I'd seen it, but hadn't absorbed it the same way you see weather reports for cities you'll never visit. "I saw something at work," she said carefully. "Something they told us not to talk about." She resumed rolling. "A patient came in last week. His blood work didn't make sense. White cell count so high the machine flagged it as an error. And his behavior, Daniel, he was restrained. And he bit through the restraint. He bit through leather." Her voice didn't waver. That was the most frightening part. She was reporting, not speculating. I asked what happened to the patient. She said he was transferred. I asked where. She said she wasn't told. I asked if he was contagious. She looked at me, then truly looked, and I understood that the suitcases were her answer. The 4th night, Marco's grandmother called our apartment. She asked my mother if she'd seen the news out of Lisbon. Corazon said she had. The old woman asked if it was the same thing. My mother said she didn't know. But that evening, she packed a 3rd bag, a child's backpack she'd found at the thrift store, and filled it with first aid supplies, water purification tablets, and a photograph of my father, who died of pancreatic cancer when I was 9. She put the photograph in last, pressing it flat between 2 shirts. I understood then that whatever she was preparing for, she believed we might not come back. The news normalized it for us. That was its function, not to inform, but to calibrate acceptable levels of dread. They called it Lisbon fever initially because Portugal reported first, though later analyses traced the origin to a research port facility in Recife, Brazil. The symptoms described on television sounded manageable: high fever, confusion, muscle rigidity, aggression. The anchors used the word aggression the way meteorologists say gusty, clinically, without conveying what it actually felt like to be in its path. Schools remained open. Subway ridership barely dipped. New Yorkers had survived everything, the collective logic went. We'd survived this. My mother didn't subscribe to collective logic. She subscribed to observable data. On the 7th night of packing, she brought home a map, not a digital map on her phone, a physical fold-out road map of the northeastern United States that she spread across the kitchen table, weighing the corners with cans of beans. She'd marked routes in red pen, 3 of them, each terminating at the same destination, a town called Hartwell in upstate New York, near the Adirondack foothills. I asked what was in Hartwell. She said her friend Lena, a former colleague who'd left the city 2 years ago, had a property there. Farmland, well water, distance. She said the word distance the way priests say grace, as though it might save us. Marco started spending more time in our apartment. His grandmother, Dolores, was 78 and increasingly anxious, calling him back upstairs every hour, convinced that the sickness on the news would reach their building by morning. Marco dealt with her fear the way he dealt with everything: jokes, deflection, charm. He was broad-shouldered, loud, Dominican Filipino like me, but raised louder. And his method of confronting discomfort was to fill the room with enough noise to drown it out. But I caught him reading the map when my mother left for her shift. His eyes tracked the red lines north with an intensity he usually reserved for basketball stats. "She's serious about this," he said. "She's always serious." "No, Danny, this is different." He tapped the map where Highway 87 branched toward the mountains. "My abuela's been watching Filipino news channels. They're showing things CNN isn't. People in Manila attacking emergency workers. Not protesting attacking, with their hands and teeth." He pulled out his phone and showed me a grainy video, filmed from a hospital rooftop. Below, figures moved through a parking lot in stuttering bursts, their gait wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. They didn't run smoothly. They lurched, accelerated, stopped, redirected like insects reacting to stimuli. One of them caught a man trying to reach a car. The camera was too far away to capture detail, but the motion was unmistakable. I handed the phone back. "That could be anything," I said. "You don't believe that." I didn't. On night 12, my mother came home 4 hours early. She walked through the door still wearing her ID badge, which she never did. Protocol required badges to stay in the building. Her hands were shaking, not trembling, shaking, like a machine running beyond its tolerances. She sat at the kitchen table and placed both palms flat on the wood, as though anchoring herself to a surface that might otherwise tilt. I poured her water. She drank half, set the glass down with exaggerated control. "They brought in 6 patients tonight," she said. "All from the same shelter in the Bronx, all with the same blood abnormality. The white cells, they're not behaving like white cells anymore. They're clustering, attacking healthy tissue. And the patients..." She stopped, picked up the glass, set it down again. "One of them flatlined at 11:15. Dr. Garrison called it noted time of death, began paperwork. She looked at me. At 11:32, the patient sat up. The glass on the table caught the overhead light and held it, a small bright circle on the surface of the water, perfectly still. "We leave in 3 days," she said. She didn't wait 3 days. None of us did. The morning after her revelation, I woke to the sound of Dolores praying through the ceiling. Not her usual rosary murmur, but the desperate, accelerated litany of someone bargaining with God against a deadline. I found my mother already dressed, the suitcases packed and stationed by the door, but this time she hadn't unpacked the previous night's version. 2 sets of bags crowded the entryway. She was on the phone, speaking rapid Tagalog to someone I assumed was Lena. Her tone was urgent but measured, the voice of a woman who'd rehearsed catastrophe until it became choreography. Marco appeared at our door at 7:30, barefoot, wearing basketball shorts and a panicked expression. "Danny, come upstairs. Now." I followed him to the 4th floor. Dolores was standing at her living room window, holding the curtain aside with one hand and pointing with the other. Below, on Delancey Street, a police cordon stretched across the intersection at Allen. Officers in standard uniforms stood behind sawhorses. But behind them, further back, near the entrance to the Williamsburg Bridge, figures in full hazmat gear moved between 2 white unmarked trucks. A line of people sat on the curb, their wrists bound with plastic zip ties, heads bowed. One of them jerked suddenly, violently, twisting against the restraints, with a force that tipped the person beside them sideways. An officer stepped forward, hand on holster. The hazmat team waved him back. "They've been there since 5, Dolores said. Her English was accented but precise, refined by decades of reading American newspapers, with a dictionary at her elbow. "I watched them bring those people from the shelter on Rivington, the one the city converted last month for overflow. The people they brought out, they weren't walking right, Marco. They were being dragged." My mother arrived behind us, having followed when she realized I'd left. She looked out the window for exactly 4 seconds. "Get your things," she told Dolores. "Both of you. We're leaving by noon." Dolores started to object her apartment, her medications, her cat. My mother cut through each protest with the efficiency of a surgeon. "Bring your pills. The cat comes. The apartment stays. If I'm wrong, you'll be home in a week. If I'm right, you'll be alive." It was the first time I heard my mother frame survival as a binary. You will be alive, or you won't. No middle territory. No negotiation. Marco and I helped Dolores pack while my mother made calls. The plan was simple. Drive north on 87, reach Hartwell by evening, meet Lena at the farm. My mother owned a 12-year-old Honda Civic she parked in a garage on Essex Street. She'd been paying for the space for years, despite rarely driving. I now understood the car was part of the contingency, maintained and fueled for this specific purpose. She'd been preparing longer than a month, perhaps longer than a year. By 10 o'clock, the television had caught up with the street. Local news broke into regular programming with aerial footage of the Rivington shelter. The building was surrounded. NYPD, FDNY, and personnel in gear I didn't recognize. The chyron read, "Quarantine enforcement in Lower Manhattan. Residents urged to shelter in place." The anchor's voice carried the thinly concealed bewilderment of someone reading words they didn't fully believe. She mentioned Lisbon fever. She mentioned the CDC. She did not mention the dead man who sat up at 11:32. My mother turned off the television. "That's the last useful thing it will tell us," she said. At 11:15, we carried our bags to the stairwell. The elevator felt like a risk my mother wasn't willing to take. She'd mapped exit routes through the building weeks ago. Dolores moved slowly, leaning on Marco, her cat carrier, in her free hand. The stairwell smelled like concrete and old cigarette smoke. On the second-floor landing, we passed our neighbor, Gerald, a retired electrician who'd lived in the building since before I was born. He was standing at his door, holding a battery-powered radio. "They're saying stay inside," he told my mother. She nodded politely and kept moving. Gerald watched us descend, the radio crackling in his hand like a small mechanical heart. Outside, the June heat hit us immediately. The police cordon on Delancey was visible 2 blocks east, but our route to the garage led west. My mother walked fast without running, a conscious calibration. Running attracted attention. Walking suggested normalcy. The garage on Essex was underground. 3 levels deep, a concrete throat descending into chemical-scented darkness. My mother had the ticket and keys ready. The attendance booth was empty. A portable radio sat on the counter, murmuring news to no one. She led us to the Civic on level 2, loaded the bags in practiced sequence. Heaviest in the trunk, overnight bag in the footwell. Dolores's medication pouch in the center console where my mother could reach it. Dolores sat behind the passenger seat with her cat, a gray tabby named Raina, who observed the upheaval with feline indifference. Marco rode beside his grandmother. I took the front. My mother drove. She navigated surface streets to avoid the bridge approaches, which the radio she allowed the radio confirmed were gridlocked. FDR Drive northbound was moving. Barely. We merged at Houston and crawled past the UN building, past the hospitals of the Upper East Side, where ambulances lined the block 3 deep, past Harlem, where I saw a bodega owner boarding his windows with plywood. The city didn't look apocalyptic. It looked precautionary. That was the cruelest stage. I'd later realize the period where catastrophe still resembled caution, where you could mistake collapse for inconvenience. We reached the Henry Hudson Bridge at 1:15. Traffic compressed to a single lane, filtered through a checkpoint I hadn't anticipated. National Guard. Not police soldiers, young and rigid, in desert camouflage that seemed absurd against the green of the Bronx riverbank. They checked IDs. They asked where we were going. My mother said, "Family upstate," with a smile so natural I almost believed we were visiting relatives. The soldier waved us through. In the rear-view mirror, I saw him stop the next car and lean in with more questions. "How did you know there'd be checkpoints?" I asked. "Because that's what happened in Manila in 2003, she said. "During SARS. The government always funnels movement before they restrict it. We're in the funnel, Daniel. We need to get through before it closes." North of the city, the Palisades Parkway opened up, and my mother pushed the Civic to 75. The landscape shifted from urban density to suburban sprawl to stretches of green that felt like a different country. Dolores fell asleep with Raina purring on her lap. Marco stared out the window, texting friends who responded with increasing alarm and decreasing coherence. His phone buzzed constantly, group chats erupting with rumors, blurry videos, conflicting directives. He showed me one message from his teammate, Jalen. "Bro, they locked down Fordham. National Guard everywhere. My mom can't get home from work. What the hell is happening?" I didn't have an answer. My mother did, but she was focusing on the road, her eyes tracking every vehicle around us, calculating distances, anticipating lane changes. She drove the way she packed with the methodical intensity of someone who'd been rehearsing this commute in her mind every night for a month. At a gas station near Newburgh, She filled the tank and bought the last 3 gallons of water on the shelf. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, said the water delivery truck hadn't come that morning. "First time in 11 years, she said, as though the supply chain owed her a personal explanation. My mother paid cash, loaded the water, and we were back on the highway in under 8 minutes. She'd timed it. I saw her check her watch. Highway 87 narrowed as we climbed into the foothills. The traffic thinned. The radio stations began to stutter, some dropping to static, others repeating emergency broadcasts in loops that grew less informative with each cycle. The phrase "shelter in place" recurred like a mantra designed to soothe through repetition rather than substance. My mother turned the radio off at 3 o'clock and didn't turn it back on. "What did you see?" I asked her. "At the hospital. The patient who sat up. What did you actually see?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "He was cold, Daniel. His skin was the temperature of the table. No pulse, no respiration. Dr. Garrison confirmed a systole." The nurse pulled the sheet up, and then the sheet moved. She adjusted her grip on the steering wheel. His eyes were open, but they weren't looking at anything. They were tracking movement, like a sensor, not a person. The nurse screamed, and he turned toward the sound instantly, faster than any patient I've ever seen move. Security tackled him. It took 4 men. Dolores stirred in the back seat but didn't wake. Raina repositioned on her lap. "He bit one of them," my mother added. "Security guard named Phil. Took a chunk out of his forearm. Phil was fine for about 6 hours. Then he wasn't." We reached Hartwell at 5:40, the afternoon light staining the hills gold and copper. The town was small in the way that upstate New York towns are small: a main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, a church. All of it built in an era when communities were measured by the distance a horse could cover before dark. Population maybe 800. My mother navigated from memory, turning off the main road onto a county route that climbed into farmland, passing fields of waist-high grass and the occasional house set back from the road, behind walls of maple and birch. Lena Dominguez was waiting on the porch of a white clapboard farmhouse at the end of a gravel drive. She was tall, angular, dark-haired, with the bearing of someone who'd spent her professional life in emergency rooms, and her personal life preparing for the emergency that would make hospitals irrelevant. She'd been a trauma nurse at Mount Sinai before she left the city. Now she kept goats, grew vegetables, and maintained a root cellar stocked with enough preserved food to sustain 4 people for 6 months. She'd expanded that calculation to 8 when my mother called. The farmhouse had 4 bedrooms upstairs, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, and a screened porch that overlooked 30 acres of meadow and forest. Behind the house, a barn sheltered the goats and a workshop. A hand-dug well provided water. Solar panels on the barn roof fed a battery bank. Lena had built this place the way my mother had packed those suitcases, with quiet, deliberate anticipation of something she hoped would never arrive. "Who else is coming?" my mother asked as we unloaded the car. "Tomas from my clinic days, and his daughter, Ray. They left Albany this morning." Lena paused. "And possibly Ben Calloway, if he got out of Syracuse." I cataloged the names. Tomas, I'd heard my mother mention him, a former ER physician who'd transitioned to rural family practice. His daughter, Ray, I didn't know. Ben Calloway was a stranger entirely. Marco helped Dolores inside while I carried bags. The farmhouse smelled like dried herbs and wood polish. It felt distant from everything from the checkpoints, from the sirens that had become Manhattan's ambient score, from the grainy footage of people moving wrong, Reina explored the kitchen with scientific precision, sniffing each cabinet door. Tomas Aguilar arrived at dusk, driving a mud-spattered Subaru with one headlight out. He was compact, silver-bearded, with hands that moved with the residual economy of a surgeon, even though he hadn't operated in years. His daughter, Ray, was my age 17, sharp-faced, with cropped black hair and a stillness about her that suggested either deep composure or advanced exhaustion. She carried a backpack and a violin case. The violin case struck me as either absurdly optimistic or profoundly human, and I couldn't decide which. Over dinner, rice, canned vegetables, goat cheese that Lena produced with evident pride, the adults exchanged information with the urgency of traders on a collapsing market. Tomas had treated 3 patients in Albany, matching the profile. Extreme fever, cognitive dissolution, unprecedented white cell mutation. 2 had died. 1 had been transported by a federal medical team he'd never seen before, operating under authority he couldn't verify. "They took my notes," he said, his fork motionless over his plate. "My files, my samples, my records, and they asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, federal letterhead." "Did you sign?" Lena asked. "I signed. Then I packed the car." Ray ate in silence, her eyes cataloging the room, the exits, the windows, the people with an attentiveness that mirrored her father's clinical precision but carried a different frequency. She was assessing threat, not symptoms. My mother unfolded her map on the table after dinner, the red lines now joined by blue annotations Lena added. Water sources, fire roads, neighboring properties with known occupants. They built a picture of the surrounding geography, the way generals build sand table exercises, every hill, stream, and access point assigned tactical value. I listened from the doorway, holding a mug of instant coffee, feeling the strange vertigo of watching your parent become someone you don't entirely recognize. The woman marking defensive perimeters on a topographic map was not the woman who hummed while making eggs. Or maybe she'd always been both, and the eggs were the disguise. Ben Calloway never arrived. The first 3 days at the farm passed in a suspension between emergency and routine. My mother and Lena organized the house with military efficiency. Sleeping assignments, cooking rotations, water rationing protocols, a watch schedule that placed 1 adult on the screened porch from dusk to dawn. Marco and I were assigned daytime perimeter checks, walking the property line twice daily, noting anything unusual. Ray joined without being asked. She walked between us, carrying a hatchet Lena had given her, and said almost nothing for the first 2 circuits. On the 3rd, she pointed to a deer trail cutting through the eastern tree line and said, "Something used this recently that isn't a deer. The prints are wrong." I looked. The mud held impressions I couldn't read, but she crouched and traced them with a finger. "Human shoes, work boots, maybe size 11. But the stride is off too short for someone that size, like they were shuffling." She stood, wiped her hand on her jeans, and kept walking. I began to understand that Ray Aguilar had been paying a different kind of attention to the world than the rest of us. Where Marco and I consumed news and feared abstractly, Ray had been studying. She'd read every available paper on the Lisbon pathogen published and preprint, and had built a mental model of the infection's progression that exceeded what the television offered. Over meals, she'd share fragments. The pathogen appeared fungal-bacterial hybrid, unprecedented in classification. It colonized the central nervous system within hours. Death occurred between 8 and 36 hours post-symptom onset. Reanimation, she used the word without flinching, followed within minutes, 2 hours. The reanimated retained motor function and auditory response, but displayed no evidence of higher cognition. They responded to sound and movement. They did not respond to speech, pain, or environmental hazard. They did not avoid fire, water, or gravity. "They're not alive," she said on our fourth evening. The group gathered in the kitchen as the generator hummed softly beneath the floor. "And they're not dead in any way we previously defined dead. The pathogen maintains the brainstem and cerebellum, while the cortex necrotizes. They can walk, grab, bite. They can't think, plan, or remember." Marco shifted uncomfortably. "You're saying they're zombies?" "I'm saying the word zombie is a cultural shorthand that happens to map onto the observable behavior, yes." Dolores crossed herself and muttered a prayer. Reina, in her lap, flicked an ear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the screened porch during Thomas's watch, and he didn't send me back to bed. We sat in darkness, listening to the insect chorus and the distant barking of a dog at some neighboring property we hadn't yet scouted. Tomas smoked a hand-rolled cigarette, a habit he'd hidden from his daughter, and told me about his wife, Elena, who died of a stroke 4 years ago. "She would have handled this better than me," he said. "She grew up in rural Oaxaca. She understood that the world's default state is not safety. Americans forget that. We build systems and start believing the systems are the world." At 2 a.m, the dog stopped barking. The silence that replaced it was not peaceful. It was the silence of subtraction, a sound removed from a landscape that needed it. Tomas stubbed his cigarette and stood. We both stared into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, feeling the particular electricity of a boundary being crossed somewhere we couldn't yet pinpoint. By morning, the internet was gone. Not degraded, gone. Phones found no signal. The radio offered only the emergency broadcast loop, unchanged for 36 hours. Lena pulled out a shortwave set she'd kept in the barn. It took her an hour to find a live transmission. A man in Vermont, his voice ragged, described watching a column of infected walk through his town at dawn. "They came from the south," he said. "Maybe 100. They walked right down Main Street like a parade. Anyone who made noise, they turned toward." The transmission dissolved into static. Lena adjusted the dial, found another signal, this one official, military, clipped. "All civilians in the designated evacuation corridors are advised to proceed to the nearest processing center. Do not travel outside designated corridors. Repeat." My mother reached over and turned it off. "Processing centers are collection points," she said. "Collection points become containment zones. Containment zones become traps." Nobody argued. On day 6, the farm received its first refugee, and with her came the confirmation that the distance my mother had purchased was not enough. Her name was Claire Okafor, and she walked out of the eastern tree line at mid-morning while Marco and I were reinforcing the garden fence Lena had asked us to fortify. She was perhaps 30, brown-skinned, wearing mud-stained professional clothes slacks, a blouse with one sleeve torn, flat shoes caked in forest debris. She carried nothing. Her hands were empty and raised, palms forward, in the universal gesture of someone who has learned that approach without visible surrender invites violence. Marco saw her first and grabbed my arm. I called for Lena, who came from the barn with a calm that I'd begun to recognize as her combat mode. The quieter she got, the more alert she was. My mother appeared on the porch. Tomas stepped out behind her with the hunting rifle Lena kept above the mantel. He didn't aim it. He held it across his body like a statement of grammar, present tense, conditional mood. "I'm not sick," Claire said from 20 yards. Her voice cracked on the second word. "I've been walking for 2 days. I was in a car with my partner, heading north from Kingston. We hit a roadblock. Not military, just abandoned cars. While we were trying to navigate around it, They came out of the woods. She lowered her hands slowly. Jordan didn't make it out of the car. Lena looked at my mother. My mother looked at Tomas. A decision was being made through a language I couldn't fully read, the silent calculus of trust, risk, and shared humanity conducted between people who'd spent their careers making triage assessments. "Come to the porch," my mother said. "We'll check you over." The check was Tomas's protocol. Temperature, pupil response, examination of any wounds. Claire had scratches from branches, a bruised knee, dehydration. No bites, no fever. She drank 3 glasses of water on the porch while my mother sat beside her and asked questions with the gentle precision of an intake interview. Claire was a civil engineer from Kingston, 31, originally from Lagos. Her partner, Jordan, had been an elementary school teacher. She described the roadblock, a pileup of vehicles on Route 28, some with doors open and engines still running, and the figures that emerged from the forest on both sides simultaneously, as though they'd been waiting. "They didn't make noise," she said. "That's what I can't stop thinking about. No moaning, no screaming, just the sound of their feet and their hands on the metal of the car." She'd escaped through the passenger window while they pulled Jordan from the driver's side. She ran into the woods and didn't stop until her legs gave out. Then she walked. 2 days of walking through forest, sleeping in a deer blind, she found, drinking from a stream, navigating by the sun and the highway sounds she intermittently caught through the trees. She was, in every quantifiable sense, remarkable. And she was shattered. Ray gave her clean clothes. Dolores made her soup. Marco offered his bed and said he'd take the couch without hesitation. A generosity so instinctive it reminded me of why I'd been his friend since we were 9. Claire ate slowly, mechanically, her eyes occasionally drifting to a middle distance where I suspected Jordan still sat behind the wheel. That evening, the adults held what was becoming a nightly council at the kitchen table. Claire's account confirmed what the shortwave fragment suggested. The infection had spread beyond urban centers. The corridors between cities, the highways, and secondary roads were compromised. Movement was possible, but dangerous. The infected were mobile, drawn to sound, and apparently capable of sustained walking across terrain that would exhaust a healthy person. They didn't rest. They didn't navigate with purpose. They followed stimuli sound, primarily with the Lena said, whether we stay or move. The debate lasted 3 hours and split the group along a fault line I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the adults against the young, or the cautious against the bold. It was those who believed in fortification against those who believed in mobility. Lena wanted to stay. This was her ground, her preparation, her contingency made real. She knew every acre, every water source, every structural advantage the farmhouse offered. Leaving meant abandoning 12 years of deliberate readiness for the uncertainty of open road. My mother wanted to leave. Not immediately, but she wanted a plan. A secondary location further north, higher elevation, more remote. This farm is defensible, she conceded, but it's findable. We're 3 miles from a county road. Anyone on that road, living or not, can reach us. Tomas mediated with the measured patience of a man who'd spent decades listening to patients describe symptoms before arriving at a diagnosis. He proposed a compromise. Fortify the immediate perimeter, establish early warning measures on the approach roads, and simultaneously prepare a departure plan with vehicles loaded and routes mapped. If the threat reached a defined threshold, they'd execute the exit. Until then, they'd build their position. It was reasonable. It was adopted. But I noticed Claire staring at the wall during the vote, her jaw tight, and I understood that she'd already lived through the moment when a fixed position became a coffin. For her, the debate was academic in the worst sense. The next morning, Marco and I began the fortification work while Ray scouted the approaches. Lena directed us with the specificity of someone who'd imagined this labor in detail. We felled small trees to block the gravel drive at 2 points, creating choke points that would slow any vehicle and funnel foot traffic into visible corridors. We strung fishing line with attached cans at knee height along the tree lines, crude but effective noise traps. Tomas and my mother established a listening post at the top of the barn's hayloft, which offered a 300-degree view of the surrounding meadow and the road below. I worked beside Marco for hours, sawing and hauling, and for stretches the physical labor replaced thought entirely. My arms burned, my back ached, and the world contracted to the immediate. This log, this hole, this wire. It was almost peaceful. Then I'd straighten up and see the meadow stretching toward the tree line. And I'd remember what Claire said about figures emerging from the forest silently. And the peace would evaporate like water on a July road. On day 8, Ray found the first one. She came back from her morning scout at a run, the first time I'd seen her move faster than a deliberate walk, and found Lena in the garden. "Quarter-mile east," she said, breathing hard. "In the creek bed. One, alone, stuck in the mud. Male, middle-aged, wearing a hospital gown. His right arm is broken bone visible, and he's still trying to move toward me." We went as a group, minus Dolores, who stayed with Raina and the shortwave. The walk to the creek took 12 minutes. The sound reached us before the sight a wet, rhythmic slapping, like a hand against mud. Then we saw him. He was in the creek bed, as Ray described, sunk to his thighs in the soft bank where the water had undercut the soil. His hospital gown was stained brown and black. His arm was fractured mid-forearm, the bones displaced at an angle that would have produced screaming agony in a living person. But he used it anyway, driving it into the mud for leverage, the broken ends grinding visibly with each attempt. His other arm reached toward us. His mouth worked open and closed without producing sound beyond a faint clicking, like a mechanism trying to engage. His eyes were open. They tracked our movement with the lateral precision Ray had described, not looking at us, but registering us, the way a security camera registers motion without comprehension. There was nothing behind those eyes. The person who had once inhabited that body, who had worn that hospital gown, while someone who loved him worried in a waiting room, was comprehensively gone. My mother stood beside me. I felt her hand on my shoulder, not restraining, but anchoring. "We can't leave him," Tomas said. His voice was clinical, but his hands were not steady. "If he frees himself, he'll follow our sound back to the house." Lena had brought the rifle. She'd also brought a shovel. She looked at Tomas. He nodded. She stepped forward and did what needed to be done. The sound was brief. Then there was only the creek. We buried him in the meadow. After the creek, something shifted in the household's emotional atmosphere, a pressure change, like the hours before a storm when the air thickens and birds stop singing. We'd been living in theory, sustained by preparation and informed by second-hand accounts. Now we had evidence. The mud on our shoes, the weight of the shovel, the image of that arm reaching these were not reports from a radio. They were memories our bodies would carry. Marco processed through action. He doubled his work on the perimeter, hauling logs with a fury that worried me until I recognized it as the same mechanism he'd used after his mother left when we were 12. Channeling helplessness into exhaustion until the body outran the mind. Claire processed through silence, retreating to the room she'd been given and emerging only for meals, her engineering mind apparently running calculations she didn't share. Dolores prayed with increased fervor, her rosary clicking through the farmhouse like a metronome of faith. Ray processed through conversation, and it was Ray who found me on the porch that evening and sat beside me without preamble. "You're replaying the creek," she said. "You're not?" I replayed it on the walk back. Now I'm integrating it. She tucked her legs beneath her on the bench, her violin case leaning against the wall behind us. My mother's death taught me something about grief. It moves through stages only if you let it move. If you freeze it, it becomes architecture. It builds rooms you can't leave. I looked at her. That's either very wise or very rehearsed. The corner of her mouth lifted not quite a smile, but the geography where a smile would be. My therapist said it first. I made it sound better. She paused. "Your mother is exceptional, Daniel. I want you to know I see that. The fact that we're here, alive, fed, with a plan, that's because she packed those suitcases." I told her about the suitcases then. The whole ritual, the nightly packing, the morning unpacking, the month of preparation that I'd observed without understanding. She listened with the attentiveness of someone who understood that stories are not told for the listener's benefit, but for the teller's survival. That night, the shortwave delivered its clearest transmission yet. A woman identifying herself as a colonel in the New York National Guard broadcast on a frequency Lena's radio found almost by accident. The colonel's message was structured and specific. Manhattan was lost. The bridges were down, demolished intentionally to prevent the infected from crossing in the densities that had overwhelmed Brooklyn and the Bronx. Albany was partially evacuated. A defensive perimeter had been established along a line roughly following Interstate 90, but it was porous and deteriorating. Civilian survival was now, in the colonel's words, a function of individual preparedness and geographic fortune. "Geographic fortune," my mother repeated. She was staring at the radio the way she'd stared at the man in the creek, with recognition, not surprise. She'd known. Some part of her, the part that drew blood and understood what moved through veins, had calculated this outcome weeks ago. The colonel continued. Military resources were being consolidated at designated strongholds. Fort Drum, West Point, the Navy facilities along the coast. Civilian processing centers that had been established in the first week were being abandoned. "If you are in a defensible position with supplies, remain there," she said. "If you are mobile, move north. The infection's progression decelerates in cold climates. This is not confirmed. Repeat, not confirmed, but observational data suggests reduced reanimation activity below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold. The infection didn't like cold. I filed this in the mental ledger I'd been keeping alongside Ray's briefings and my mother's observations. The ledger was growing heavy. Lena turned to the group. "We're 200 miles south of the Canadian border. If this colonel is right about temperature, we have a window maybe 3 months before winter gives us natural protection. We need to survive until then." 3 months. The number hung in the kitchen air, simultaneously enormous and insufficient. Tomas calculated supplies. With rationing, the root cellar and garden could support our group for approximately 4 months. Water was not a concern, the well was reliable, and the creek, despite its recent occupant, ran clean upstream. The limiting factors were medical supplies, ammunition, and human endurance. "We can do this," my mother said. It wasn't optimism. It was assessment, delivered with the same flat certainty she'd used when telling me we would leave in 3 days. I believed her, because I'd spent my life believing her. And because belief was the only currency that still held value. On day 14, the second group of refugees arrived, and with them came the first real fracture in our household's unity. There were 4 of them. A married couple named Victor and Sandra Haynes, their teenage son Caleb, and a man traveling with them named Dale Purdy. They drove a pickup truck loaded with camping gear and firearms, 3 rifles and 2 handguns visible in the truck bed, along with cases of ammunition that rattled metallically as the vehicle bounced up Lena's gravel drive. Victor was the one who'd spotted the farmhouse from the county road, he said. Seen the solar panels, the goats, the signs of organized habitation, and decided it was worth approaching. Victor Haynes was 45, broad, bearded, with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. He was an electrician and sometime contractor from Saratoga Springs, and he narrated his survival with proprietary pride, the routes he'd chosen, the threats he'd neutralized, the decisions he'd made that kept his family alive while others faltered. Sandra was quieter, watchful, with bruised circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless vigilance. Caleb was 15, thin, avoiding eye contact, holding a hunting rifle with a familiarity that suggested he'd grown up with it. Dale was indeterminate mid-30s, sparse-haired with a nervous energy that manifested as constant small movements, fingers tapping, feet shifting. He deferred to Victor in all things. Lena welcomed them with measured hospitality and the same medical screening Thomas had performed on Claire. All clean. She offered them the barn workshop, which had a wood stove and enough space for sleeping bags. Victor surveyed the property with the evaluative eye of a man assessing an acquisition rather than accepting charity. He noted the solar setup, the well, the defensive perimeter we'd built, and nodded with a satisfaction that bordered on entitlement. "You've done good work here," he told Lena, "but your fencing's wrong. Those choke points on the drive are a start. But you need cleared sight lines on the north approach, and those tin can tripwires are kindergarten stuff. I've got real motion sensors in the truck, battery-operated, infrared. We'll set them tonight." He spoke with authority, and the authority was not entirely unfounded. Victor knew things. He understood electrical systems, structural reinforcement, tactical positioning. His contributions were immediately valuable, but his knowledge arrived packaged in an assumption of command that grated against the collaborative structure my mother and Lena had built. The tension surfaced first over food. Our rationing protocol, calculated by Thomas based on existing stores and projected needs, required adjustment for 4 additional people. Victor's truck carried supplies, canned goods, dried meat, water, but he was reluctant to pool them. "We brought our own," he said at the first shared meal. "We'll eat our own. Fair's fair." My mother pointed out that shared resources managed centrally would last longer than individual hoarding managed by anxiety. Victor smiled a smile I recognized from men who treated disagreement from women as a quaint negotiation tactic rather than a substantive position. "I appreciate the thought, Corazon, but my family's provisions were earned by my family's preparation. Pooling dilutes accountability." The word accountability did something to the room's temperature. I saw Claire's jaw tighten. Ray's eyes narrowed. Marco stopped chewing. Dolores, who spoke rarely in group settings, said clearly from the end of the table, "In my village in Bacolod, when the typhoon came, we shared everything. Those who hoarded were the first to starve, because they were the first to be left alone." Victor's smile didn't waver, but it hardened at the edges. Sandra placed a hand on his arm, a gesture I initially read as support, but later understood as restraint. That night, my mother came to the room I shared with Marco and sat on the edge of my bed. "Watch Dale," she said quietly. "I drew his blood today for Thomas's health screenings. His veins were fine, but his hands, he has scratches on both hands that he says are from brush. They're not from brush. they're from fingernails. I watched Dale Purdy the way my mother asked, not with suspicion, but with the focused attention she'd trained me in since childhood. Watch how people hold things, Daniel. Watch what they look at when they think no one is looking at them. Watch the gap between what they say and what their body is doing. Dale's body was doing something his words contradicted. He spoke cooperatively, agreeing with Victor, assisting with chores, nodding at appropriate moments. But his eyes moved independently of his conversation, scanning exits and sight lines with the restlessness of a man accustomed to calculating escape routes. He slept in the barn with the Haynes family, but positioned his sleeping bag nearest the door. He ate quickly, defensively, curled slightly over his plate. When Caleb, a quiet boy, who seemed perpetually startled by his father's volume, accidentally dropped a pot lid in the kitchen, Dale flinched so violently that his chair scraped backward 3 inches across the floor. I shared my observations with Ray during our morning perimeter walk. She'd noticed the same patterns independently, plus one I'd missed. Dale avoided proximity to the rifle rack Lena had established in the front hallway. Not in the way of someone unfamiliar with weapons, but in the way of someone who knew precisely what weapons could do and had specific reason to maintain distance. He's been through something beyond what Victor's story covers, she said. Victor talks about their journey like a highlight reel, every obstacle overcome, every threat handled. Dale doesn't contribute to those stories. He just nods. What do you think happened? Ray didn't answer immediately. We walked in silence past the eastern tree line, where the fishing line tripwires had been supplemented by Victor's infrared sensors. I think their group was originally larger than 4, she said finally. On day 17, the infection came closer, not to the farm, but to the surrounding geography. From the barn's hayloft observation post, Lena spotted movement on the county road below a loose column of figures walking north, perhaps 30, spaced irregularly, their gait carrying that distinctive wrongness Claire and Ray had described. They moved without cohesion, drawn by some shared stimulus invisible to us, their heads occasionally turning in unison toward sounds we couldn't hear from that distance. They passed the intersection where our gravel drive met the road and kept going. They didn't turn toward us. The distance and the elevation and the absence of significant sound from the farm kept us beneath their threshold of detection. But they were close, 2 miles from our door. Victor reacted to this intelligence with decisive energy, organizing the installation of additional sensors, advocating for regular armed patrols, and proposing a watch schedule that placed his people, himself and Dale, in control of the nighttime hours when threat was highest. Lena agreed to the enhanced security, but rejected the restructured watch, maintaining the existing rotation. Victor accepted this with visible displeasure, a concession he cataloged in whatever internal ledger measured his authority relative to others. The more substantive conflict ignited over Dolores. She'd developed a cough seasonal, according to Tomas, consistent with allergies aggravated by the barn dust and meadow pollen. But the cough sounded aggressive in the farmhouse's acoustic, and Victor heard it from the kitchen where he was having coffee. He found my mother in the hallway. "Your friend needs isolation," he said, "until we know it's not the fever." "It's not the fever," my mother said. Dr. Aguilar examined her. Dr. Aguilar is a family doctor from a small town. No offense to him, but I've seen what happens when people miss the signs. In Saratoga, a shelter took in a woman with a cough. 3 days later, that shelter had 40 infected inside and no way out. My mother's posture changed in a way I recognized from childhood, a straightening, a settling, the physical preparation for a confrontation she would not lose. Dolores is not infected. She's a 78-year-old woman with allergies. She will not be isolated. She will not be treated as a threat. And if you suggest it again, Victor, I will invite you to reconsider the terms of your welcome." The kitchen was silent. Sandra looked at the table. Caleb looked at his father. Dale looked at the door. Victor held my mother's gaze for a long 3 seconds, then smiled his hardening smile and raised both hands. "Just trying to keep everyone safe, Corazon." He walked out to the barn. The screen door clapped shut behind him. That night, Marco told me he'd overheard Victor talking to Dale in the barn. "He called your mom a liability," Marco whispered, his face rigid with anger. "Said Dolores was dead weight, and the farm would run better under unified leadership." Unified leadership. His leadership. I lay awake, listening to the house settle around me, and understood that the infected weren't the only threat converging on our position. The breaking point came on day 21, though its origins ran deeper than any single event. It began when Caleb spoke to Ray. They'd been paired on an afternoon water hauling task carrying buckets from the well to the kitchen's filtration system, a routine chore that required 2 people and minimal conversation. But Caleb, who'd barely spoken since arriving, found in Ray a listener whose silence invited rather than demanded. Between the well and the kitchen, the 15-year-old began to talk. Ray told me that evening, on the porch, her voice held low to avoid carrying. Caleb had confirmed what she'd suspected. Their group had originally numbered 7, not 4. 3 others, a woman named Peg, her husband Mitchell, and their dog, had joined the Haynes family outside Saratoga. They'd traveled together for 2 days. On the second night, camped at a rest area off the highway, Mitchell had developed a fever. By morning, he was incoherent. Peg refused to leave him. Victor made a decision. He didn't say what the decision was, Ray told me. He just said his dad handled it, and then they drove away. He said Peg was screaming. He said she was alive and screaming, and they drove away. I sat with this. The screened porch was dark, and somewhere in the meadow, a night bird called once and didn't repeat. "There's something else," Ray said. "The scratches on Dale's hands. Caleb said they happened during the handling." Mitchell fought back. Not because he was infected. He was sick, but still himself. Dale held him while Victor... She stopped, reset. Caleb didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I found my mother in the kitchen. She was cleaning the counter with the focused attention she applied to tasks when her mind was working at a different level. I told her what Ray had told me. She stopped cleaning but didn't put down the cloth. "I knew something was wrong with that story," she said. "Victor describes their journey without gaps. But survival stories always have gaps. The gaps are where the worst things live." "What do we do?" She folded the cloth into a precise square. "We protect our people, and we prepare for Victor to become a problem we can't avoid." The problem arrived the next morning. Victor approached Lena with a proposal he'd drafted, literally written on notebook paper, numbered and bulleted like a corporate memo. It outlined a restructured governance of the farm, a leadership council of 3, consisting of himself, Lena, and Tomas. Decisions would be made by majority vote of the council. Resource allocation, security operations, and admission of future refugees would fall under council authority. Below the proposal, in a section titled Efficiency Measures, he'd listed Dolores and the cat as non-contributing dependents requiring review. Lena read the document at the kitchen table while the rest of us ate breakfast. Her face was a study in controlled fury, each sentence absorbed, processed, and cataloged in whatever filing system governed her response hierarchy. She set the paper down, aligned it with the table's edge with geometric precision, and looked at Victor. "This is my property," she said. "My preparation, my food, my water, my shelter, extended to you and your family out of shared humanity in a crisis. You've been here 7 days, Victor. You don't get to reorganize my household because your ego requires a title." Victor's smile appeared, that hardening curve. "This isn't about ego, Lena. It's about survival. You're running this place like a commune. Communes collapse. Structured leadership endures. Your version of structured leadership left a woman screaming on a highway while you drove away." The room went absolutely silent. Caleb, at the far end of the table, turned white. Sandra's hand found Victor's forearm and gripped. Dale stood up so abruptly his chair fell backward, the crash explosive in the stillness. Victor's smile vanished. What replaced it was something I hadn't seen on a human face before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold reorganization. A recalculation of alliances and enemies performed in real time behind his eyes. "Who told you that?" he said. "It doesn't matter who told me. What matters is what it tells me about you." Victor looked around the table, his gaze landing briefly on each face, performing the arithmetic of support. My mother met his eyes without expression. Tomas met them with clinical detachment. Marco met them with open hostility. Ray met them with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided which direction to move, if movement becomes necessary. "We'll be in the barn," Victor said. He left. Sandra and Caleb followed. Dale hesitated at the door, his eyes finding my mother's face for a moment. And in that moment, I saw something I didn't expect. Not loyalty to Victor. Fear of him. Victor's family stayed in the barn for 2 days. A cold separation that felt like a siege within a siege. Sandra came to the farmhouse once for water and lingered by the kitchen door as though she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words or the safety to speak them. Dale came not at all. Caleb appeared at the garden fence on the second afternoon and found Ray weeding tomatoes. They talked quietly for 10 minutes. When Caleb left, Ray came to find me. "Caleb says his father is talking about leaving," she said. "Taking the truck, the guns, the supplies. Heading for Fort Drum, where the military stronghold is. He wants Dale to go with him. Sandra's trying to convince him to stay." "Do we want him to stay?" Ray pulled a weed with methodical force. "I want Caleb and Sandra to stay. They're not Victor." That evening, the decision was made for all of us. At dusk, the infrared sensors on the north approach triggered 3 sharp beeps from the receiver in the kitchen, a sound we'd tested but never heard in earnest. Lena grabbed the receiver. The screen showed multiple activations, cascading from north to south along the sensor line. Something was moving through the northern tree line. Not one something. Many. The hayloft post confirmed it within minutes. Tomas, on watch, called down in a voice stripped of its usual calm. "There's a column, coming down the ridge from the north road. I count at least 50. They're following the creek bed south." The creek bed. The same creek where we'd found the first one. The path of least resistance through the terrain, the natural corridor that led, with terrible directness, toward our farm. Victor burst from the barn as the alert spread, rifle in hand, Dale and Caleb behind him. For the first time since the confrontation, the divisions didn't matter. Geometry mattered. Time mattered. My mother took command with an authority that seemed to surprise no one, least of all herself. "Lights off. Everything, house, barn, porch. No generators. Absolute silence." She dispatched Marco and me to extinguish the solar batteries' connected lamps. Lena killed the house circuits. Within 2 minutes, The farm plunged into a darkness alleviated only by the half-moon above. We gathered on the screened porch, 10 people and a cat, silent as held breath. Tomas stayed in the hayloft with binoculars. His reports came by whispered relay, passed from him to Claire at the barn door to Ray at the porch steps. They're at the bend, quarter-mile, still following the creek, heading south-southeast. Current trajectory passes the farm's eastern boundary at approximately 200 meters. 200 meters, the length of 2 football fields. Close enough to hear a raised voice, a slammed door, a dog's bark. The goats. Lena's face changed in the dark. The goats were in their pen beside the barn, and goats were not silent animals. She moved for the barn. Victor grabbed her arm. "Leave them," he hissed. "If they bleat, they draw them away from us." Lena wrenched free. "They draw them toward the barn, where your son is." She disappeared into the darkness. I heard the pen gate, the soft shuffling of hooves on straw, the barely perceptible sound of animals being guided inside and given feed to quiet them. The column passed. We heard them, not the cinematic groaning of fiction, but a sound far worse. The collective footfall of dozens of bodies moving through brush without regard for obstacles. Branches breaking, water splashing, a continuous low-grade disruption of the natural landscape that sounded like the forest itself was being dragged south. It lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes of stillness on the porch, of Dolores's rosary beads moving without clicking because she held each one between thumb and finger before advancing, of Marco's hand on my shoulder pressing hard enough to leave marks I'd find the next morning. They passed east of us, following the creek as Tomas predicted. The sensors reactivated in reverse order, south to north, as the tail of the column moved beyond their range. Then silence returned, genuine and vast. And Dolores exhaled a prayer she'd been holding for the full transit. My mother's hand found mine in the darkness. Her fingers were cold but steady. "That's what I was afraid of, Daniel," she whispered. "Not one, not 10, a current. They move like water, and water always finds you eventually." The column's passage catalyzed what argument could not. By morning, Victor and my mother were standing over the same map. Their conflict shelved not resolved in the face of a shared conclusion. The farm's position was no longer tenable for winter. The creek bed had become a highway, and highways carried traffic in both directions. The cold that the colonel had described as the infection's inhibitor was still months away. And in those months, more columns would follow the same terrain. The next group might not walk past. Lena accepted this with the grief of someone amputating a limb they'd built with their own hands. I watched her stand at the kitchen window at dawn, looking at her garden, her goats, her solar panels, the barn where she'd stacked 12 years of readiness. And I saw the exact moment she released it. Her shoulders dropped a quarter inch. Her hand on the counter opened, as though letting go of something invisible. "North," she said. "Toward Drum. Not to the military near it. Close enough to benefit from their perimeter, far enough to stay independent." She turned to the map. "There's a fire station in a town called Olmsted, 30 miles south of the base. Stone construction, built in the 40s, designed to survive anything short of a direct bomb. If it's unoccupied, it's defensible. If it's occupied, we negotiate." The preparation took 2 days. We loaded both vehicles, the Civic and Victor's truck, with food, water, medical supplies, weapons, and personal items. Lena dismantled her solar panels and battery bank with Marco's help, strapping them to the truck's roof rack. Tomas organized the medical supplies into 3 redundant kits so that if one vehicle was lost, the essentials survived. My mother packed with the same precision she'd applied to the suitcases on Delancey Street. Every item chosen, positioned, and accessible. On the final evening, I found Caleb sitting alone in the empty goat pen. The animals already loaded into a trailer Lena hitched to the truck. He was holding the notebook paper his father had written the governance proposal on. He'd folded it small and was turning it over in his hands. "I'm sorry about what my dad did," he said without looking up. "About what he's like." The words had the weight of things carried too long in silence. He wasn't always this way. Before Mom got sick the first time years ago, cancer, she's okay now. He was different. The sickness changed something in him, made him believe that control was the same as caring. I sat beside him. The pen smelled like hay and absence. "My mom packs suitcases every night," I said. "For a month. She packed and unpacked our whole life every single day. I thought she was losing her mind. Turns out she was the only one who had it." Caleb looked at me. "My dad thinks he's protecting us. He's wrong about the method. But the fear underneath is real." It was the most generous interpretation of Victor Haynes I'd heard. And it came from the person with the most reason to condemn him. I didn't agree entirely, but I acknowledged the complexity. People under pressure don't simplify. They fracture along existing lines, and the fractures reveal architecture that was always there. Load-bearing fears, hidden reinforcements, structural compromises made long ago that only become visible when the building starts to shake. We left at dawn. My mother drove the Civic. Lena rode beside her with the map, the route marked in green, this time a color, Lena said, that meant hope in the Catholic iconography Dolores taught her. The truck followed, Victor driving, Sandra beside him, Dale and Caleb in the back seat. The rest of us distributed between vehicles. I rode in the back of the Civic with Ray. Dolores sat between us, Raina in her carrier on the floor. As the farm receded in the rearview mirror, Ray reached into her backpack and pulled out her violin. She didn't play it. She held it across her lap like a child holds a favorite book, not for reading, but for knowing it's still there. The road north was empty. The sky was clear. My mother drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, steady as the woman who hummed while making eggs, steady as the woman who packed suitcases, steady as the woman who saw the dead rise and decided, in that irreversible instant, that her son would live. We reached Olmsted on a Wednesday. The stone fire station standing exactly as Lena had described, solid, empty, waiting. Its walls were 2 feet thick, built in an era when permanence was an architectural value rather than an economic liability. We cleared it room by room, finding nothing but dust and the ghost of civic purpose. By evening, we had a roof, a perimeter, and the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. Not safety, not home. Something between arrival and continuation. My mother unpacked the suitcases for the last time. She placed each item in its new location with a ritualistic care I'd watched 100 times on Delancey Street, transforming a stranger's building into a structure that could hold us. When she finished, she folded the empty bags and put them in a closet. She didn't leave them by the door. That night, I asked her when she first knew, not suspected knew. "When Phil sat up," she said, "when the dead man's eyes tracked movement, I knew the world we lived in was already over. I just needed time to build the next one." She built it with suitcases and silence and a love so fierce it looked like fear. I understand now. It was never fear. It was the opposite.